Good afternoon to everyone in the name of Christina Howard, and welcome to the second panel of the conference, The Long History of Claims for the Return of Cultural Heritage from the Colonial Context. My name is Christina Howard, and I'm replacing my colleague Julia Binter as a chair of this panel, who unfortunately became ill. After the first panel on early claims that have not been successful, we look now at successful claims of restitution during the colonial period. One exception is Liberia, which successfully resisted colonization. The panel is entitled Restitution Before the International Restitution Debate. With our panel papers, we will set a focus on Indonesia, Liberia, and Nigeria today with talks by, and now you have to help me, Panggah Ardiyansyah, Lars Müller, and Amanda Hellman, and a comment on the papers by Ciraj Rassool. We have already heard him yesterday. We will look at how claims were made, why they were successful, what were the arguments behind, what were the political, geopolitical, and economic conditions for the restitutions, and what different social actors have been involved in the restitution claims and processes. But before we start, let me shortly introduce our speakers. And I will just introduce the first speaker in the hope that Christina will take over after the first paper. Panggah is a PhD candidate of History of Art and Archaeology at SOAS University of London. His primary interest is on the afterlives and knowledge production of Hindu-Buddhist materials in Indonesia. He will talk about object as pusaka, the 1930s return of Bone-Gowa regalia, and how it resonates into the contemporary Indonesian restitution debate. Panggah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and I hope you can see my slides fine. If not, please let me know. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Larissa Forster, who has invited me to present my perspective on restitution, particularly from the case study of Indonesia. So, in this presentation, I aim to show how historical research can inform us on the possible and sensible paths in moving forward our discussion on restitutions. And it is with that objective that I am going to start with Bone-Gowa in the island of Sulawesi. So Bone-Gowa is actually two separate kingdoms located in the southern part of Sulawesi Islands. You can see the blue and red cones on the map. They both were founded in the 14th century and had a long tradition of hostility towards each other. By the early 17th century, Bone, who was overpowered by Goa, sought help from VOC, or the Dutch Indies Company. And the company, already vying to control the region as an important port for spice trade, used the opportunity to manage and monopolize the political power as well as the trade through Bungaya Treaty in the mid-17th century. With the disbandment of VOC at the end of 18th century, the Dutch colonial government tried to take over the control of the region and launched a series of military campaigns throughout the 19th century. They were faced with fierce oppositions, and only in 1905 and 1906, the military managed to subdue and completely subjugate the regions under the control of the colonial governments. It was through these wars that the regalia from Bone and Goa were collected as booty, and some of them were sent and kept in the museum in Batavia, then the name of Jakarta, and in Leiden, in the Netherlands. Before I move to the next slide, you can see in the map that I also put a black cone for Mataram Kingdom in the island of Java, which I will talk later as well. So about the return of Bone and Goa regalia in the 1931. The objects that were stored in Leiden were returned to, were returned to the Goa by the request of the son of the Goa king. And then at the same year also, the 61 objects were shipped to Makassar to be returned to Bone. 20 of them were considered regalia, including an umbrella, a spear, and 2 kris. In 1937, 14 objects were sent to Makassar, again, to be returned to Goa, including a crown, a sword, and an umbrella. And it has not been noted before, but it appears to me that these returns coincide with the coronation of new kings in 1931 and 1937 of Bone and Goa. And I think this historical context is important when thinking about the importance of the return of the Bone Goa regalia to the local peoples. So far, I have been largely following the historical narrations and the list of objects provided by Hari Budiarti in the edited volume, Colonial Collection Revisited. The case study of Bone and Goa regalia has been highlighted by Lars Müller also in his working paper in the preparatory of this conference. Thus, it is important to point out that at this point, that the edited volume, came out of a joint project between the Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands and the National Museum of Indonesia, called the Shared Cultural Heritage Project, that ran from 2003 until 2006. The project itself sought to trace the history of colonial collecting and distribution of objects mainly between Batavia and Leiden in the 19th century and 20th century. But more importantly, it stopped short in discussing the question of future returns. It is within this context that I position my paper, which is to draw on the writing of Budiarti and use the Bone-Gowa case as a starting point to expand the discussion discursively around the framework of returns, both in the past and in the present. One of the key observations by Budiarti is that some of the object returns to Bone and Goa were considered as kalompuang by the peoples of Bone and Goa. At first glance, the words kalompuang can be translated as regalia for its exclusive and pageantry characters, only to be shown to public during a court-sanctioned ceremony. However, the word regalia may not sufficient to fully understand the meaning of kalompuang to the local people in Bone and Goa. Rossler has noted 2 other layers of meaning for kalompuang. These are social and religious ones. In this sense, the kalompuang serves not only as a symbol of power, but also a representation of communal belonging based on kinship, as they believe that the kalompuang objects were handed down by their ancestors, their common ancestors, who descended from heaven. And because it is believed that they came from the supernatural worlds, the kalompuang function as a tangible link between the seen and unseen realms. Budiarti wrote in the chapter that the objects were only received in Goa in January 1938, based on when the colonial reports of the absentee was dated. However, I would suggest that the kalompuang objects had arrived earlier and were used in the coronation ceremony for I Mangi Mangi Daeng Matutu Karaeng Bonto Nompo Sultan Muhammad Tahur Muhibun, the king of Goa, the new king of Goa, in 1937, as seen in the image in the slide. We can at least observe 2 objects as described by Budiarti. The first being the crown salokoa, which was topped by a Buddhist stupa form, worn by the king. The second is the sword sudanga, which Budiarti said the most important regalia, with the length of 60 centimeters and width of 3 to 6 centimeters, of which this description rather matches with the sword held up by the new king. There was also mention of umbrella being returned, but the description was not provided, so we do not know whether the umbrella in the photo was one of the objects returned to Goa. Of course, at the moment, we cannot fully certain whether the kalompuang in this photo were the object returned from Batavia. But at least from this photo, we shall see the symbolic importance of the objects for the authority of the ruler and the community, and ultimately why the need to request such objects to be handed back to them. Moving away from Goa, from Bone and Goa, and into the wider context of Indonesia, we find another term that highlights similar character with kalompuang. Some say that the word pusaka or pusoko in Javanese may come from Malay or Austronesian origin. And thus it has a wider use in Indonesia, mainly in the islands of Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. However, when compared to kalompuang, pusaka has a more pronounced and attachment to the ruler. In this sense, the communal value of pusaka derived from the function and sacred duty of the ruler owning the pusaka to hold the world together, not to descend into chaos. The holder of pusaka is said to be divinely chosen, thus projecting a spiritual prowess, which signify an aspiration for better future through the rule over a community. More importantly for our discussion on restitution today, pusaka is an enduring concept within Indonesian cultures, proved to be able to adapt and respond to cultural changes, particularly related to the system of social culture and organization. But before I go on with this enduring quality, I would like to first highlight another example of colonial context return, as they relate to objects belonging to the category of pusaka. So here we have the story of the return of pusaka belonging to the Mataram Kingdom, Java, in 1737. The story began with the power struggle that had caused the king, Amangkurat III, to flee the court in 1705. And was exiled by VOC to Sri Lanka in 1708, carrying the pusaka with him. Tricking after him, after Amangkurat III had reigned without the pusaka. But when Pakubuwono II was struggling for political influence, he requested VOC administration in Batavia to facilitate the return of the pusaka from Sri Lanka in October 1736. Then in May 1737, the descendants of Amangkurat III were repatriated to the court of Mataram around Surakarta today, along with the pusaka, which include a keris, jacket, and a pike, and also a saddle. At this point, I would like to highlight the type of object we have discussed so far: keris, sword, umbrella, and crown, and how they were deemed and put to serve as pusaka in the traditional structure of polity, making them the symbol of social status of the rulers, as well as their supposedly personal qualities, not only spiritual, but also physical in the battlefield. So a brief note on the colonial context of return in Bone-Gowa and Mataram, that while the initial consideration might go to the utilization of traditional system in serving imperial and colonial objective, here we also witness the shrewdness of the subjugated local court to negotiate within their own limited means. In that sense, they were leveraging their subjugation to the colonial power to proactively seeking means to create and manage a prosperous community of their own through the ownership and usage of regalia, sacred symbols. So moving forwards to the nation state of Indonesia today. Indonesia, as the successor of those disparate kingdoms in the archipelago, uniting them in the construction of modern nations, began co-opting the concept of pusaka to serve its nationalist objective. Particularly, we see this process with this catalog publication of the National Museum of Indonesia in 1992, in which the museum argues for its being as the important keeper of the pusaka of Indonesia. Here, the selected museum objects serve as the link between the Indonesian national community and its modern historiography. So much of its historiography were built and drawn from the historical knowledge written by colonial scholarship. So understanding the importance of the concept of pusaka in the context of Indonesian as a modern nation, I would argue that we can use pusaka as a framework to make sense of the selection of some of the objects returned to Indonesia by the Netherlands in more recent time. On the slides, there were two objects returned in the 1970s, the stone statue of Ratna Paramita and the painting of Prince Diponegoro. Indonesia, in its historiography, has been arguing for the presence of a golden age in its distant past, which coincides with the Hindu-Buddhist art historical period between 4th and 15th century. It is the age that's soon to be followed by a dark age, of which the region of Indonesia were controlled by European colonial power. In its modern iterations, Indonesia strived for cultural achievements such as those in the Golden Age. And here, the beautifully made Ratna Paramita statue, the left image, is considered the masterpiece from the Golden Age. On the right, we see the painting of brave Prince Diponegoro when captured through Dutch treachery, after he led a devastating Java War in 1823 until 1830, and is officially one of the national heroes of Indonesia, despite the fact that Indonesia as a nation, or even as a unifying term, has not even existed in the 19th century. Another case study, we can see it from the Nusantara collection returns in the 2010s, that it was offered initially in 2014 as a bulk collections consisting of 14,000 objects from Indonesia. However, in the middle of the process, Indonesia stopped the negotiations because they believed that they were not afforded the time and means to actively select the objects that are deemed to have relevance with the modern Indonesia as a nation. There are now 1,500 objects that were finally transferred to the National Museum of Indonesia in December 2019. So to conclude this presentation, I think it will be apt to think about the future of restitution in Indonesia. So learning from the case study of Nusantara, earlier this year, a committee was set up by the government to consider object repatriation for Indonesia, to research and provide recommendation of objects that should be claimed and requested to be repatriated from the Netherlands. In this context, we can see that Indonesia tries to proactively inserting themselves into the construction of meaning for the objects now kept in foreign museums. It also means that not all objects will be deemed significant to be returned, and Indonesia will selectively and strategically put the requests for the objects. A second point is on inclusivity, which comes from the historical awareness that Indonesia only came into being in the mid-20th century, constructed from various communities and polities that have their own specific experience with the colonialism. On these fronts, there are arguably objects that will be excluded from a nationalist framing, but remain important to a particular communities within Indonesia. But the call for inclusivity here is not only for the perspective of Indonesia, but also the need to rethink the international legal structures underpinning the process of restitutions that are likely set up between one government to another. The situation in Indonesia may be better for recognized local courts, such as Yogyakarta, who would be able to directly establish contact with foreign institutions. But it will be more difficult for the Adat community, akin to traditional kinship, who do not have legal government structures and necessary capitals in their disposal. And on that note, I will end this presentation. And thank you, and look forward to it.
Thank you a lot. With the next paper, we go back from the 1930s to the 1920s. Our second speaker, now with the video, our next speaker is the historian Lars Müller, who is the academic coordinator of the Paese project, a project on provenance research on extra-European collections in Lower Saxony since 2019. And he's doing research on transnational debates on post-colonial returns of objects, with a focus on calls to Germany and the United Kingdom. His recently published working paper has as part of this conference has already been mentioned, and you find it on our conference website. And I'm sure my colleague Zoe will also share the link again in our chat. Last to speak about the return of the Mafue stone in the 1920s and the struggle of its collector Hans Schomburgk for his reputation. Lars Müller, you're here. Yes.
Sorry, I was still muted. Thanks for the kind introduction, Maria and Julia. I just share my screen. I hope that you all see my PowerPoint presentation. Good. On May the 17th, 1924, the Senate Commission on Imperial and Foreign Affairs in Hamburg, Germany, received a letter from the Liberian Consul General Momotu Massaquoi. The German citizen Hans Schomburgk was on its way from Liberia to Germany and had stolen a monumental stone against the will of Liberia, thereby creating serious tribal uphills. The matter was urgent and it was feared that the stone would disappear if it would not immediately detained. The Hamburg authorities informed the police, who confiscated the stone upon arrival. What followed were negotiations about the return of the stone that lasted for several months. My following paper will focus on these negotiations. First, however, 3 remarks. First, about the colonial context. Liberia was an independent state in 1924, like Maria and Julia already mentioned. When I speak about collecting in a colonial context, I do so in a broad definition. It also addresses the activities of collectors that made use of colonial networks and similar power imbalances. And it also means collecting with a colonial mentality. For instance, when activities are based on the assumed superiority of the collector's own culture or the aim to preserve cultures deemed to be in a state of decline. And this is both clearly the case with Schomburgk. Secondly, about the sources of this paper, I will mainly talk about the negotiations for the return. It must be clear that this is largely reconstructed from sources from various German archives. It leaves gaps in the description of the inner Liberian discourse. About the problems to doing provenance research there, I can say something later on if somebody would like to know more about that. Third, about the focus on the paper. The current discussion on restitution demands for return of objects are strongly focused on the question how the object was acquired. Was it in a morally or legal correct way? That makes decision about restitution appears mostly as a consequence of incorrect actions. In addition, the focus is on institutional reasons that hinder or encourage restitution or returns. For example, the desire of museums to represent the world in their collection, or there is a focus on the political side in the context of international relations. In this case study, I aim first to show how difficult it is to identify the context in which an object was collected. And secondly, I would like to take a closer look on the individuals involved in the process, especially in the collector Hans Schomburgk, to demonstrate that the question of the return is also strongly based on personal interests. The structure of the paper, I will start with the main facts about the case from different points of view. In the second part, I will talk about the negotiations. And after some concluding remarks, I would like, if there's time, to add some information about the relevance of the case up till today. But let us turn to the case study. How did the letter from the Liberian Consul General Mafue came about? First, about the acquisition of the stone. Hans Schomburgk was a self-taught African explorer. Between 1898 and 1958, he traveled about 10 times to different regions in Africa, among others nowadays Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, South Africa, or Angola. He visited Liberia twice. In 1912, he carried out cartographic work on behalf of the Liberian state. He also captured various animals and subsequently became Liberia's military attaché to London. In his second travel in 1923, he did some documentary film work and collected objects for German museums. His profession in Germany was to convey knowledge about Africa, whatever that means for him at that time. And he did lectures, he did documentary films, and he wrote a number of books. His counterpart in this case was the Liberian Consul General to Germany, Mafue. He was called the first African diplomat to Europe. In Germany, the name Mafue is still known because of his grandson, Hans Jürgen, who wrote a famous autobiography about his time in Hamburg during the Third Reich. The basic facts about the case are undisputed. Schomburgk traveled through the northwest of Liberia, including the present-day Grand Cape Mount. This is marked in red, and the northern part of this region is the Gola-Kone district, marked in yellow. He shot several film clips and acquired the Mafue stone from the Gola group and transported it to Germany. Beyond that, the version of the story differ. Schomburgk declared to the police authorities that he had traveled to the region with the intention to acquire various objects. He was informed that in Breze, the seat of the chief of the Connes section, that there was a stone carving with a crocodile. He recruited a Gola woman named Clara Ditchfield as an interpreter and advisor. She negotiated with the chief, Yolu Zuma, and afterwards he told Schomburgk that the stone was for sale for £1 sterling. Schomburgk paid this amount, the agreed amount, in witness of Ditchfield and Hetman Momoru. He declared afterwards, and I cite, I maintain that the Mafue stone has never been the property of any country, order, or secret society. It has always been the property of an individual. The stone has been brought to Connes section by a man from Farley at Fisherman's Lake. The stone has always been the property of the chief. It lay openly in the town of Breze for years, but after the Gola uprising in 1916, it was put into the bush by the people because it was supposed to have brought some bad luck. The chief was not only willing to sell the stone, but he was happy to have it removed from his land at all, end quote. During a stay in this region and also during his stay 14 days in Monrovia afterwards, there was no really protest against his actions. But when Chief Botu, and I cite again, who was known to be a drunkard, heard about the stone and without having the slightest right to it, since the stone had never been in his district, he complained to the Secretary of State for the Interior. End cite. Schomburgk talked to the minister, who refrained from bringing charges against Schomburgk because Liberia had no law against the export of antiquities at that time. Schomburgk pointed out, and I cite him again, if the government had asked me to return the stone at that time, I would have done so. But at that time, there were only insinuations that the stone had been acquired illegally, end quote. And another quote from him, since it was not an object of value, but purely scientific research, there was no financial advantage for me in acquiring this stone. The opposing side was Mafue. He pointed out mainly 4 aspects. First of all, that the stone was not the property of the chief, but a national property, and therefore not for sale. I cite him. The stone in question is a monument sacred to the memories of the ancestors of that section of Liberia, where it was found. For centuries, it has been there, and it is still reverted to the people in these sections. It is no man's property, but the property of the entire country, nor can it, under the communistic law of the tribe, be sold by any one individual. Second, he pointed out that Schomburgk did pay something, but that he paid something for the filming of the object and not for taking the object. Third, he pointed out that Schomburgk brought the object not back to Monrovia, but via a colleague to Freetown in Sierra Leone, and that he thus smuggled the object out of the country. And fourth, Mafue agreed that the stone had been in the forest, but he also pointed out that it was regularly visited by people. Liberia was astonished that such a well-known researcher of African culture would have not known this. And Mafue made a striking comparison, and I cite him again. For one to sell a stone of this kind is linked onto a man removing one of the stone eagles from the monument of Bismarck here in Hamburg, or from the top of the Siegessäule in Berlin, or any other important relics of Sanssouci, and the same consternation that would be created if a foreigner carried out one of these objects is such as is created now in the section of Liberia where the stone has been taken from. The different versions of the acquisition of the stone were a problem for the German authorities. The contradiction could not be solved, and that would lead to a lifting of the confiscation of the stone by the German police. But both the Hamburg authorities and the German Foreign Office were interested to clarify the matter without disgruntlement of Liberia. Therefore, the Foreign Office intervened as a moderator of the negotiation to secure good relations with the government in Monrovia. The Hamburg Public Prosecutor's Office proposed a compromise. Schomburgk was to hand over the stone voluntarily. In return, the Liberian side has to make a bona fide statement. A bona fide statement here as a legal concept means that Schomburgk acted in good faith. In this case, that there was no conscience of wrongdoing, also there was a defect of law. Schomburgk agreed in principle, but he demanded what he called a declaration of honor. This was important to him to secure his reputation as one of the important conveyors of knowledge about Africa in Germany. Secondly, he demanded to take replicas to give them to museums in Germany. This was important to secure his role as a collector for museums. Long negotiation followed, but it was in the interest of all actors to find a compromise. The lack of evidence endangered Liberia's hope to get the stone back in court. The media now reported more intensively about the threat and this threatened to damage Schomburgk's reputation. Moreover, the Foreign Office was concerned about Germany's reputation as international media also started to reporting about the case. And finally, Hamburg's merchants intervened because they feared for their business in Liberia. After length talks, Liberia reluctantly offered to grant Schomburgk the benefit of doubt, how they called it. And they wrote a letter. There is no doubt that Schomburgk believed to have acquired the stone from the paramount chief in a legal way. Following this letter, the Public Prosecution Office in Hamburg dropped the case against Schomburgk. The stone was released by the police and replicas were made. Just how fragile the agreement was and how much it depended on the personal sensitivities became apparent shortly after. Schomburgk was told that Mafue told other people that he gave him just the benefit of doubt to get the stone back, but that he was the opinion that Schomburgk had stolen it after all. Schomburgk wanted to withdraw his consent to the agreement, and he wrote to the Foreign Office, I have no desire to let a man like Mafue spoil my name and reputation. But it was already too late, and it could not stop the following events. The stone was given back to Liberia and transported there on January the 5th in 1925. With that, I would like to conclude. It was an early case that an African country wanted to settle a return in German court. And this is important to emphasize that the German authorities recognized these and that they could try, that they wanted to try it as theft in a court. The reason that it failed, or rather the negotiation between the Foreign Office and the different actors started, is that the exact historical circumstances could not be sustained in court. And this is the case in quite a lot of claims for restitution or for return of objects. But accordingly, however, both sides argued in official documents with legal arguments. Internally, however, other factors emerged. The Foreign Office was concerned about the relations to Liberia. The Hamburg merchants were worried about the trade relations. If we go to the personal level, another factor plays an important role. For Schomburgk, at this point, and this points clearly, and this is clearly important also for other cases. The effect, the effect on his reputation were particularly decisive. He earned his living by bringing knowledge about Africa to a German audience with documentaries, films, but also with acquisition from museums. All this were part of his activities, and he made a living out of it. The case, which was also reported publicly, clearly had the potential to damage these activities, be it that he was clearly proven to have committed a theft, or even that he was accused of ignorance for the local cultural customs. At the same time, Schomburgk was not generally opposed to restitution, but it was important to him that it was not understood as admission of guilt. Beyond the case study, it is important to emphasize that even if legal arguments are often in the forefront of the discussion, other dimensions of restitutions are equally crucial for action. Political debates have already been addressed in various papers, or very prominent in Cynthia Scott's book on cultural diplomacy. In this context, securing good relations also closely linked with economic interest. Beyond that, however, a personal level can be as crucial as the other reasons for the question of restitution, especially in the case of people who have collected more or less for academic purposes. A demand for restitution and the accusation of theft can have massive repercussions on the persons who collected the objects. Even if the individuals involved are not against restitution in principle, they would feel compelled to ensure that their reputation was not damaged or is not damaged. With that, I would like to, I think I have another minute to say something what it means nowadays and what the consequences had. Schomburgk felt free after that to present his finds of the find of the Mafue stone as a scientific success in different films and books, without talking about the return of the object. Today, replicas of the stone are in a museum in Berlin and in a museum in the Mark. There's also one object digitized without mentioning the return of the stone, but we have to point out that the online database just pointed to the basic information of the objects. In Liberia, the history of the stone plays another role. Today, it is in the National Museum in Monrovia, and even if it's merely presented on the floor, broken in two parts, probably during transport, a small plaquette tells the story of the return. It should be noted that the circumstances here are not correctly reflected, dating the story to the 60s and 80s instead of the 1920s, but it was correctly in a guided tour through the museum exhibition. It should be also noted that not only the object, but also the removal and the return of the object is told here, and that even more space is spent on telling the story about the return of the object than it is used to describing the function of the object. And with that, I would like to end. And just another picture. This was the official return of the stone, and we see Mafue in the middle of the picture with a Mafue stone right in front of him. And on the left side, we see a representative of the Wernerman lines who brought the stone back. And on the right side, we see von Bohlen, a representative of the Foreign Office. It has to be noted that Schomburgk is not on this picture. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Lars Müller. If you want to read more about this, as we said, have a look at the working paper. We are also working on a German translation on this paper, so it will be in German and English available soon. We already have popping up one question, but we will save it for the end of this panel. And I will continue with our third speaker. Our third speaker is Amanda Hellman, currently curator of African art at the Michael Carlos Museum of Emory University and newly appointed Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Ashkenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University, a post that she will take up in early 2022. Congratulations to that. Amanda will talk about building a cultural legacy and the national memory, the repatriation of the Bascom Bronzes.
Thank you so much. Just get everything situated here. Thank you so much for organizing this conference and this panel. I'm really excited to share this case with you. I think it'll complement the other cases very nicely. In 1938, William Bascom, a doctoral student from Northwestern University, purchased 2 cast bronze Ife sculptures that had recently been excavated from Nigeria and brought them back to the United States. This led to a campaign by the Oni of Ife, the chief of Ife, and the colonial officer, Kenneth C. Murray, for the repatriation of these works, and also helped them create a strategy to request the return of other looted visual culture, including works stolen during the Benin Punitive Expedition in 1897 and Leo Frobenius's collecting campaign in 1910. This incident also led Murray and the Colonial Office to establish the Department of Antiquities in 1943, in part to address growing concerns that Nigerian cultural material was being removed from the country. The Bascom incident in particular gave Murray the rhetoric and helped him build the connections he needed to begin a larger movement to define antiquities, protect the removal of antiquities, and request the repatriation of antiquities that had already been exported. Today, I'll look more deeply at the climate of repatriating objects during the last 2 decades of colonial rule to show how an argument for the return of cultural material was formed. As has been discussed, the Germans' own surveys and their influence on museums and anthropology in Britain seems tangential to the Bascom case. However, the fact that the Germans were interested in African antiquities and culture, and the fact that they funded exploratory missions to collect and research in Africa, motivated the British to do the same. I don't want to dwell too much on the case of Benin because it is well known, and Audrey Peraldi examined an earlier request yesterday, but I do want to highlight that financially backed by the Kaiser, the Germans acquired much of the looted works that the British sold to finance the expedition. The German interest in archaeological exploration on the African continent hit its peak in the early 20th century with the tour of the continent by ethnologist Leo Frobenius. And I think, you know, it is comparable to Schomburgk's expedition that Lars just discussed. And here's the, required, explorer photo. It was during his 4th trip in 1910 that Frobenius landed in Ife, Nigeria, the heart of Yoruba land. In 1911, Frobenius tried to leave Ife with terracotta and bronze artifacts, which he purchased from the Oni. The British colonial resident, Charles Partridge, prohibited him from exporting olukun, a brass head, which led to a media frenzy, and Frobenius was accused of stealing objects of worship. He responded with venom towards the British that if he had, quote, been guilty of unlawful conduct previously, we certainly should not have been permitted to travel anymore in the colony, end quote. While he did not leave with olukun, he did leave the country with a significant amount of visual material. Another outcome of this expedition was The Voice of Africa, an account of his travels. Less than 2 decades later, British colonial officer Kenneth Murray arrived in Nigeria to develop an art program for the education department. As an itinerant art teacher traveling across southern Nigeria, developing art curricula and training teachers, he saw the way in which traditional techniques, artistic practices, and the objects themselves were disappearing. In 1934, he began to actively survey the visual culture of Nigeria, the first of dozens of tours. He also used these missions to broaden his collection with clear intentions to acquire on behalf of a future Nigerian cultural institution. In a letter written to his mother at the time of the survey, he explains, quote, "I am not bringing these home, but intend to give them somewhere like Uamia, where they could be kept in a museum," end quote. Murray tried to comprehensively assess the state of traditional Nigerian art and collect high quality work, but his surveys often contained gaps because of his inability to gain the trust of local officials, including the Oba of Benin and the Oni of Ife. Murray would use Frobenius's The Voice of Africa as a reference to locate missing works through much of the work described in the tome, but much of the work described in the tome had simply disappeared. Murray wrote after one survey that Frobenius described how in 1910 he collected from Abadan 2 carved doors. These he was made to return, and now they do not exist. Through these surveys, Murray understood that to build a collection of Nigerian antiquities, his efforts had to extend beyond active collecting. He needed to stop the export of work from Nigeria and seek the repatriation of objects that had migrated overseas. To this end, the case of Bascom and the Ife heads necessitated that export regulations be enforced immediately, eventually serving as the basis for the Antiquities Ordinance, and the case was one of the driving forces for the establishment of a formal department. In 1938, 17 cast bronze heads were excavated in Ife when a man digging a foundation for his house near the Afen, or the Oni's house, uncovered the heads. Supposedly, a number of the heads were restored to the Oni, and 3 heads were taken abroad. Of those 3, one was purchased in Ife by H.M. Bate, editor of the Nigerian Daily Times, and successively acquired for the British Museum by Lord Kenneth Clark, director of the National Gallery. The remaining 2 heads were purchased by William Bascom and brought to the United States. Like Frobenius 30 years earlier, Bascom claimed that the Oni knew of the excavation and purchase. What is unclear from Bascom's correspondence and the established scholarship is how the Oni felt about the purchase. The Oni articulated that he begrudged Bascom's argument that the heads would do more good outside of Nigeria, and disputed whether Bascom removed the heads legally. He wrote of Bascom, quote, "If he had acquired the heads honestly, why did he not mention it to me before he left Ife," end quote. But in a contradictory letter from the Oni of Ife to Bascom, the Oni states, "We all know how you have got the heads and recognize the fact that there was no law forbidding you from doing so at the time that you did." The confusion surrounding the Bascom dispute is important as it provided the fledgling antiquities section a rhetoric regarding the export and repatriation of Nigeria's antiquities that is still used today. There was another case of expats in possession of antiquities. For example, Gerald Wormel, director of labor in Nigeria, invited Murray to see a few Yoruba works, quote, "which he had collected in the old and common illegal way of keeping articles confiscated by the police," end quote, that were in dispute or evidence in court cases. Murray tried to obtain such objects for the museum, but not as fiercely as his efforts with Bascom. So perhaps Bascom was a scapegoat that allowed Murray and Duckworth to leverage the support of Malcolm MacDonald, Secretary of State for the Colonies, who issued an urgent request to the colonial governors in 1939 to exert control over the exportation of cultural artifacts. MacDonald's pressure triggered cooperation from Governor B.H. Burdillon to prohibit the export of objects and resulted in a grant from the Carnegie Foundation to fund a museum in Ife. It was also this support from the Colonial Office that led to Murray's post as surveyor. World War II interrupted the progress of the case against Bascom, and by the time Murray could return to his attention to the case, he did so as the director of the newly created Department of Antiquities. Murray was appointed in 1943 during a meeting in which the members of the Colonial Office discussed museums in Lagos and Ife, antiquities legislation, and the protection of antiquities. Bascom was allowed to return to Nigeria during World War II, but the Colonial Office kept tabs on him, in part because Murray feared Bascom would continue to freely remove antiquities from the country. By the end of the war, Murray was in a position to regulate all objects exported from the country, and he pressed forward with the repatriation of Bascom's Ife heads. He did this for several reasons. Without a strong collection of antiquities, the Colonial Office would not consider their case for a museum. 2, a high-profile case would increase the government's awareness of the international interest in Nigerian antiquities. And finally, Murray also believed that returning the rightful owner of the property to the Oni would strengthen their alliance when it came to time to funding and building the museum in Ife. This adds an important layer because one could argue that the Oni was not, in fact, the rightful owner of the Ife heads, bringing up a key issue that we are grappling with today. How do institutions repatriate works to the rightful owner? It is not until 1948 that Murray mentions enlisting the help of the United States consul to deal with Bascom. Perhaps this was also a result of Bascom's image in the journal Nigeria. In a letter from that year, Murray referred to, quote, Bascom complaining about the constant attacks on him in Nigeria, end quote. But this proved to be useful leverage when in 1950, Murray wrote in a letter home that Bascom agreed to repatriate the Ife heads upon the retraction of their public disparagement. He says, I think this result has been reached by the tactful diplomacy of the man in the sect who has been dealing with this and who fortunately knew Bascom, end quote. The issue was settled by fall 1950 when Murray noted, quote, I hear that Bascom is satisfied with my withdrawal of accusations against him, so he will now be returning the 2 heads, a great victory, end quote. In October 1950, Bascom and his wife, folklorist Berta Bascom, returned the heads to Nigeria. And in March 1951, Murray wrote that I also collected the Bascom Ife heads, which the Oni had brought to Lagos. They are better than I expected, probably the best too. They are now back here waiting to be packed, end quote. For Bascom, however, the compromise was not settled. Before he left, Murray stated in a letter that the Bascoms opposed the customs regulations prohibiting the export of antiquities and dwelled on the sacrifice that they had made. Perhaps Bascom felt as though he was forced to return the heads in exchange for permission to continue excavating in the country. Murray, however, was grateful for Bascom's decision. He hoped that it would encourage other anthropologists and museums to consider returning their own collections to Nigeria. Part of Murray's frustration was he felt anthropologists, archaeologists, and the British Museum should help rebuild the collections for a future Nigerian museum. William Fagg, keeper of ethnography at the British Museum, assisted in the development of Nigerian museum collections. He offered to make copies of many of Nigeria's most treasured antiquities in the British Museum's holding, which obviously did not satisfy Murray. He also made purchases on behalf of Nigeria's antiquity section. For example, works from the collection of Dr. Robert Allman, who was the principal medical officer in Nigeria in 1897, some of whose collection ended up in the British Museum. But he also outbid Murray and increased the market value of antiquities in the secondary market. The British Museum was both an ally and a fierce competitor. Fagg was not always willing to purchase for Nigeria's collection. Perhaps his purchase on Murray's behalf, either in Nigeria or in England, helped to easily secure export permits for the government. In one instance, just prior to his purchase of the Allman collection and 2 months before the Antiquities Ordinance was passed, Fagg and Murray went to Oye to purchase works that Fagg wants for the British Museum. And I agreed to take it back, but I would not promise a permit for its export. We are sore about the way the British Museum sold 3 Benin panels to America, competes with us for Benin works, charges almost market prices for what it sells to us, and expects to get works from Nigeria at cost price. Murray was highly possessive and competitive in his approach to the Nigerian antiquities market. He sought to ensure that Nigerian works remained in the country despite any favors his contacts might have done for him. It took 14 years from Bascom's removal of the Ife heads to the passing of official laws regarding export of antiquities and cultural objects, which seems maybe not like such a long time, but considering initiatives made by other West African colonies, such as Ghana and Sierra Leone, which passed ordinances in 1945 and 1946 respectively, it is a long time. Murray's successor and brother of William, Bernard E.B. Fagg, explained that one of the central purposes of the Antiquities Department is to act as the executive arm of the Antiquities Commission in its effort to prevent the illegal export of valuable works of art and to curb the activities of petty dealers in antiquities, including some known to be financed from abroad, who are doing so much irremediable damage to the study of Nigerian art history and the documentation of its traditional cultures. The Bascom case is significant when considering the work of Murray for two reasons. The first is that it gave him a case to demand attention from the colonial government regarding antiquities. The second is the impact it had on the precedent and rhetoric of repatriation, which still exists today. The National Commission for Museums and Monuments, formerly the Department of Antiquities, currently requests that their antiquities be returned, citing the case of the Ife heads as the acknowledgement that antiquities were moved from the country even before the Antiquities Ordinance of 1953 should be returned to Nigeria. The Bascom controversy also reveals the many ways in which works were smuggled and exported, requiring that export regulations be created and enforced. This was not immediately obvious because though there were cases in Britain for the identification and protection of monuments and antiquities, there was no model for export regulation, in part because the British saw themselves as buyers of the world's visual material, not sellers. To regulate the Nigerian export laws meant that they were restricting their ability to buy antiquities from their own colony. This was until 1946, when the Great Britain Reviewing Committee for the Export of Works of Art was established by royal charter. Perhaps due to Britain's interest in the antiquities of Nigeria, particularly for the British Museum's collection, there was some hesitation to move ahead with formal legislation that would restrict the import of works from Nigeria. Furthermore, the strict legislation that Nigeria was implementing would complicate Britain's own ability to sell Nigerian artifacts abroad. In 1951, an application to export a Benin bronze leopard head similar to the one seen here came before the committee. The British Museum and the Colonial Office petitioned for Nigeria to bid for the work. The committee agreed and also resolved that the Nigerian Colonial Office should have the first right of refusal for all work being sold from Britain and valued at over £1,000, and that they would have the opportunity to comment on the application to export. In conclusion, shortly after this victory in England, Murray was able to solidify legislation in Nigeria. A draft of the Antiquities Ordinance, which was first proposed in 1939, was sent to the 3 regional offices for approval before law officers would prepare it to be published. In November 1952, the Antiquities Bill was published and scheduled to be discussed in spring 1953, when it passed without resistance. The ordinance defined antiquities as anything created before 1918, any object excavated, and any object used in religious ritual. It empowered the Antiquities Commission to issue export and excavation permits, consent to museum development, and catalog monuments and antiquities or declare them protected. These parameters were a major accomplishment for Murray. Before the decade was complete, Murray retired and the Nigerian independence was finalized. And while the safety and preservation of antiquities was now secured, there was and is a long road ahead to the restitution of Nigeria's diverse visual heritage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all for your presentations. My name is Sarah Fründ. I'm one of the curators of this conference. And me and my colleague Jan Husken are going to take over the discussion at this point. But before we go into the questions and into the discussions, I will just quickly lead over to our interlocutor. Our interlocutor is going to be Ciraj Rassool. He is professor of history at the University of the Western Cape and directs its African program in Museum and Heritage Studies. He has previously chaired the scientific committee of the International Council of African Museums and currently serves on the high-level Museums Advisory Committee of UNESCO. Ciraj Rassool has published widely in the fields of political biography, museum and heritage studies, memory politics, and visual history. And we have already seen him last night, so we are really grateful that you are here again, and we are really curious to hear your thoughts on this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to all my colleagues for their wonderful presentations. And I have gotten some sense of some papers and slides of their presentations beforehand. I don't have a set of coherent comments, but I have some reactions to each paper that make me think about what happens when you think about restitution historically. What happens with the language that we use, and how these are sometimes synonyms, and how they actually have political and practical effects, and how they have different meanings. Our colleagues from the United States use the term repatriation. You can repatriate something under your jacket, bring it back, bring it home. But restitution is increasingly a concept that involves claims making, and where you study claims. This is also, of course, about the history of the movement and regulation of artifacts, and what we broadly call heritage resources management, or regulatory regimes over import and export, smuggling, and there are a whole series of conventions and so forth that pertain to that. But our interest is also in the museum and what these developments do to the museum. And so the case that our colleague Panggah Ardiyansyah has brought to our attention, I think, is very interesting, around pusaka, kalompuang, but the history of regalia and royal objects, crown, sword, coronation regalia, umbrella, and we saw some of the images. And what's quite a question that is interesting for me, for us to think about, is what happens when we start instituting a kind of hierarchy of the artifact, when they are deemed to belong to royalty and they belong to the state in a certain kind of way. And to that, if we even begin affixing the concept of the masterpiece. And I suppose what I would have liked to have seen more is a discussion of meaning making. Not that these meanings are just fixed in these concepts, but what happens when they enter the museum? What happens when they return? And I think there's a lot more that can be done. A greater attention to what happens in the museum, and a wider discussion of meaning making that I think would just be extremely interesting. Lars Müller, of course, also this very interesting case that raises all the questions that we are concerned with about what do we mean by colonial. And we, as my colleague Larissa knows, I worry about this notion of colonial context, because colonialism is not just a context, it's more than that. It endures, and it obtains, as we have heard, even when there isn't formal colonial rule. And once again, I suppose I was interested as he spoke. I was very interested in the deployment and the use at different times of the concept of antiquities, what that does to the object. what kind of meanings it conjures up, why that is the term that we used, why was it used then, and do we continue to use it today? And I was interested in the dilemmas that he posed towards the end of his paper, concerned, for example, that of the focus in the National Museum on the story of the return of the object and not on the function of the object. And that is, I mean, should be fairly obvious that it's, I would imagine that the National Museum is not an ethnological museum. And what happens when the object is deemed to be an object of the nation and you tell the story of the object in a certain way? But I'm interested in the concept of antiquities in any case and what this does to the museum. And finally, Amanda from Michael Carlos Museum, where I had the pleasure of spending a lot of time about 13 years ago in what is a museum of copies, in the times that when we played ball with Ivan Karp and Corey Kratz. It made me think once again of our need to historicize the colonial. And it made me want to go back to histories that unfortunately I only learned as an economic historian in my earlier preoccupation with political economy. And one of the key features of that period after the Second World War, and even the early Bascom period, just in the prelude to the Second World War, was something that historians have called the second colonial occupation, and how that was different from what came before the First World War. And how it was that those circumstances created the possibilities of restitution in the absence of sovereignty, or restitution with a belated or an early desire for sovereignty, maybe a dependent sovereignty. And whether in this collecting history, and I apologize for my dogs, but these are the perils of our domestic lives. What I suppose the point that I'm making is, how do we understand these dynamics of the imagination of a national museum in the early 1950s, an imagination of the protection of the movement of antiquities, the desire for regulatory regime, and the kind of diplomacy that was already taking place before independence. And that you have, what was this? How do we understand it conceptually in the nature of the museum and in the relationship between the museum, between the object and people? Once again, the antiquities question comes up again. It's not just about how it is defined in some policy or some law, but it's, what is the value of this concept of antiquities? And so, and I wonder what this might have to do with indirect rule and the benevolence of the museum. How the museum is deemed to be an institution of care, so that it wasn't a threatening institution to the fundamental structures of colonialism. That the museum was part of the dynamics of a certain kind of rule, colonial rule at the local level, and that in fact the displacement of the object might have posed a certain kind of threat to the dynamics of colonialism itself. But these are just the ramblings of a tired man who had to give too many presentations yesterday and is immersed in complicated discussions with the German government about visas for his students and so forth. But thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to all my colleagues for their wonderful papers.
Well, thanks, Ciraj, for the inspiring rambling. I found that very interesting. And I would like to ask the speakers if any of them would like to come back to anything that Ciraj said. You need to turn on your mics again if you do so, because they have been turned off. I think you can just go. I think, Amanda, you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to respond. Yep. I mean, I think, you know, you're absolutely right that the museum sort of plays a really important role in actually the interest to bring objects back. And I do think that Murray's interest was not in restitution more broadly. I think it really was in getting the physical object back into the country, sort of at all costs. And I also think that his primary motivation was the museum more than anything else. And really his sole focus of his whole career. And I think you're right that he saw it as a way to sort of legitimize and get, a certain amount of attention from the colonial government that he felt he couldn't get otherwise. And I also think he wasn't engaged in a theoretical discussion about what a museum could be and how it could become a space of national identity and things like that. I think he really had the experience of walking into places like the British Museum and seeing that you put objects in a case and then you write a label and then you put some objects in storage. And he was sort of mimicking that. And so it was really actually the next decade that he started to, I think, engage more critically with the museum space, but wasn't quite able to think about how to conceptualize the museum beyond the sort of physical building. And in the same way, I think he treated repatriation of objects and antiquities in that same way, where it was really about the physical object, the physical space, more than this sort of larger idea of what that represented and what that meant. So I think you absolutely kind of hit the nail on the head with that kind of sort of thinking about what this case represents, and also it sort of means that it's different than how we're talking about restitution and repatriation today in some respects, and in other respects I think that discussion is often dehistoricized, and so knowing how this sort of came about, I think, becomes really critical to understanding why we're talking about it the way we're talking about it today.
Thank you. Panggah or Lars, do you also want to comment?
Yeah, maybe on the another point that you mentioned, that I'm interested in what happened to the object after it was returned. I think it is an important question to ask, not that it has to be, or that it is a decisive argument if we talk about restitutions that we now have to do. It's not important what happened to the object, but to ask what happened afterwards, and for whom was it important, and which role did the object play for different actors involved. And I think it is important to point out in my case study that in Germany there's more or less a gap. It was not a case that was remembered. Schomburgk played his role and told his story that he found the stone and it was scientific research, but the museums have not remembered this at all. But that it is remembered in Liberia, and that we have a museum there where the story is still told, and that it is important for the national identity is too big for that because it's just one object in the museum, but it is important for them and for the National Museum. And for me, it was also interesting to ask why it is in the National Museum and not why it was not given back to the Gola, for example, because the Gola demanded it in the beginning. But it was sent to the State House and later to the National Museum. So it became, it was an object from a specific group in Liberia, and now it is an object from the national state of Liberia. And I think that is an interesting thing. And I think we can see other stories where objects were given back. For example, 2 weeks ago, I was in Ghana, in Kumasi, and I had a guided tour through a very small museum. And there is one object that is actually a state gift from Queen Elizabeth. So it was not a restituted object, but it was given back during a state visit. And the guided tour spent the most time on this object to tell the story how this object came back to the region and how important the return of the object is and was for the people in this region. I think it is interesting to ask what happened afterwards, because nowadays we often talk about it as a starting point for cooperation and so on. And in the historic cases, you see in most of the cases, it's not a starting point of cooperation or another thinking about colonial times. But nevertheless, it is important for these states to get it back and it makes something there.
Panggah, maybe because there's already a question for you in the chat, I would take you up next, but I also have a question and maybe you can kind of combine the answer. And my question relates back to what Ciraj also said about the shifting of meaning and the change of meaning. And I would be really interested again in this concept of pusaka, because if I understood you correctly, then there's something of a shift. So initially pusaka was related to royal regalia of certain kingdoms, and then pusaka came to mean something like national heritage, national heirloom. And in the last slide, you also, you kind of hinted at that there's now a movement of also looking at regional pusaka or at something that's more on a community level. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on this shift of meaning that is apparently occurring.
Yeah, thank you for the response from Ciraj and also the question from Sarah, and also for Mas Class as well for writing the question in the chat. Yeah, one of the reasons why I'm bringing up the term pusaka is that I think I'm approaching this question of restitution also from the decolonial lens, decolonizing lens, trying to open sensitivity to different regime of value rather than for grounding, let's say, Western construct knowledge, but also acknowledging the local knowledge from Indonesia. In this case, it's pusaka. And yes, I've highlighted that pusaka was meant for, or still mean for still means royal regalia today. Some of the local court, they are recognized local courts such as the Yogyakarta Palace, Surakarta Palace, they still have their own pusaka. And but also we see another layer of meaning for pusaka today in Indonesia, whereby the National Museum used this to highlight the selection of objects that they have, and particularly with the masterpiece that they have in the National Museum, and they call it as pusaka. And one of the things that struck me also as well is that in the National Museum as well, as you can see from both object from behind me, they are actually not in the National Museum of Indonesia, they are in Leiden. But several similar objects like this, Hindu-Buddhist objects, is actually part of the masterpiece of the National Museums. And is also a response to the question of coloniality from Ciraj as well, because the how do you say it? The kind of exaltation, the kind of grandeur, of glorious meaning of these objects is actually started by the Dutch scholarship, by the British scholarship during the colonial time in Indonesia, whereby they argue that these are the most accomplished art of Indonesia. And after this, the culture decline, the local cultures are in decay, so they need to be. They need the help of the colonial power to resurrect that kind of masterpiece. And it was also taught to this kind of notion was also taught to the early nationalist figures in Indonesia as well. So they kind of took this at face value, kind of something like that, and then just trying to put this still in the pedestal of the national heritage in Indonesia. So also the question of colonialism is also part of this paper as well. And for the question from Staatliche, yeah, so I'm not really sure about whether there are still objects that considered as kalompuang by the Khoi and Bone and Goa peoples in National Museum or in Leiden, because I'm afraid of speaking for them at this moment. But I think it's better actually to have this discussion directly to the people of Bone and Goa and see whether they still consider a collection in this museum as part of their kalompuang as well. There's also interest. I would like to also point out to this interesting project, a past project actually, by LifePath's artist collaborations in Indonesia back in 2017, when they made an exhibition on the collection of Batak in northern Sumatra that was collected and then now stored in the Brussels Museum. When they interviewed the Batak people, actually, whether they want the object back to Indonesia or to Batak area, the Batak people actually said no, because they believe that the objects actually lost its soul, kind of, and they just want to create new objects, and then they will put the souls into this new object. So it's actually interesting case, and I think it's also highlight the importance of actually speaking to the people that give meaning to these objects in retrospectively. I think that's my response for now.
Maybe I can take the chance for one last question, or maybe two questions for Lars Müller, because I will also pick up the question Jos van Beurden already pointed in the chat. Yes, Lars, you already talked about the problem of restitution between the nation states. So I had the main question, is it really a successful restitution if it's not returned to the Gola people in this case? And there have been, for example, recently the article by Vasi Apo and Andreas Mehler on the problem of regional restitution, to keep also this in mind, but we can discuss it in another time. So I would like, in the matter of time, to focus on the question from Jos van Beurden. You spoke about Massacro's statement that communist law of that group forbade it. Can you elaborate on this a bit? Thank you, Lars.
Not as much as I would like to. First of all, thanks for the question. I think it is very important. But the problem is that I have no direct voice of the Gola people. Massacre spoke for them, or other representatives of the national state spoke for the Gola people. And I think that is a problem, because they also told different stories about the meaning of the stone and about the organization of the Gola people. Maybe they didn't know better, or they chose the story for the special event if they talked to a newspaper or if they talked to the court. So Mafue said there's a communistic law, and it was some kind of religious object. What kind of religious object changed in different stories from him, but that means that it it belongs to every one of the Gola people, not to one person, but to all the people, all the Gola people, and that somehow contradicts his main argument that it is a national belonging and not a Gola belonging, but a national belonging. So he contradicts his own argumentations to a certain extent, but I can't solve that. I just can add one other thing. I talked with the National Museum about it, and they said to me that the stone has nearly no meaning anymore for the Gola people. And even back then, because they just made another stone, and so the old stone was not important at all. But that would also mean that it was not important to give it back at all, because if they can reproduce these kind of things as often as they want, the special meaning of the stone is not really there to return it. And that leads to your question, what is a successful return or restitution? And probably we have to ask for the criteria to answer that question, but mainly it's for different people a different answer. And for the German actors in this case study, it was just given back and it has no meaning at all up till today. And for the Gola people, it was not a successful return, but for the national state of Liberia, it was a success. They made press releases in international press and German press, and they were an African state who managed to get something back, and that was really important for the state of Liberia. So for them, it was a success, but yeah.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you, Lars, for your answer, and thank you all for presenting these really interesting case studies. We are a bit delayed for the poster presentation, but I will kindly invite you all. For now, we have a chance to meet 5 interesting scholars and to discuss 5 interesting case studies in the poster session, which you can access from the main stage. So we have come to an end for this panel now, and again, thank you all for your participation.
Thanks a lot.